Imagine this: you sit in meditation, breath slowing, mind settling into stillness. The room dissolves. The endless chatter of thoughts begins to quiet. For a moment, just a fleeting, sacred moment, you touch something vast. Boundless. A presence that has always been there, waiting beneath the noise of your everyday existence. You feel it, the interconnectedness of all things, the illusion of separation falling away like a veil. This is what they call awakening. The beginning of seeing through the constructed reality you've mistaken for truth your entire life. But here is a truth rarely spoken about. A truth that confuses, frustrates, and sometimes even shames those who walk this path. Alongside heightened awareness, many spiritually awakened people find themselves struggling intensely with lust. Not a simple attraction, but a powerful inner tension that feels contradictory to their search for peace, balance, and transcendence. Think about this for a moment. Why would someone who meditates, reflects, and seeks higher understanding feel overwhelmed by desire? Why does lust often grow stronger, not weaker, after awakening begins? And most importantly, what if this struggle is not a failure of spirituality, but a hidden doorway to deeper integration and wisdom? Stay with me, because the final insight in this journey is the most important and transformative of all, and it has the power to completely change how you understand desire, control, and spiritual growth. This channel is dedicated to exploring the deepest reflections of great philosophers, psychologists, and thinkers who dared to look honestly at human nature. Here, ancient wisdom meets modern insight to help you navigate daily challenges with clarity and depth. If you are someone who feels called to self-knowledge, inner growth, and understanding the invisible forces that shape your behavior, you are in the right place. Take a moment now to subscribe, leave a like, share this video, and comment your thoughts, because what you are about to hear may shift the way you see yourself and the world. You open your eyes, return to the ordinary world, and within hours, sometimes minutes, a different force rises within you. Not transcendence. Not peace. Not the serene detachment you read about in ancient texts or heard described by spiritual teachers. No, what rises is raw, urgent, and undeniably physical: lust. A hunger that feels almost volcanic in its intensity. A craving that seems to mock everything you've just experienced. Your mind recoils. How can this be? How can someone who has glimpsed the infinite, who has tasted the dissolution of ego, who has dedicated themselves to rising above base instincts, how can they simultaneously feel consumed by desire? This is not the gentle attraction of romantic love. This is something darker, more primal, more relentless. It arrives uninvited, often at the most inconvenient moments, during prayer, after reading sacred philosophy, in the quiet hours when you're supposed to be cultivating inner peace. It feels like betrayal. Like evidence of failure. Like proof that perhaps you were never truly awakening at all, but simply deluding yourself. And here's what makes this unbearable: you can't talk about it. Spiritual communities celebrate purity. They reward the appearance of control, of transcendence, of having moved beyond such lower concerns. Admitting that you're drowning in desire while simultaneously experiencing profound spiritual insights feels like confessing to a crime against the very path you've chosen. So you hide it. You carry the shame in secret. You wonder if everyone else on this journey has somehow mastered what you cannot. You begin to believe that your struggle with lust is evidence of spiritual inadequacy, a sign that you're not evolved enough, not disciplined enough, not pure enough to deserve the awakening you've glimpsed. But what if everything you believe about this struggle is backwards? What if the intensity of lust you're experiencing isn't a sign of spiritual failure, but a consequence of spiritual progress? What if the very awareness that allows you to perceive deeper truths is the same awareness that makes you feel desire more acutely? What if the awakened mind, stripped of its usual distractions and defenses, becomes hypersensitive to every current of energy moving through the body, including sexual energy? Consider this carefully. Before awakening begins, most people live in a kind of numbed existence. They're so identified with thoughts, roles, and social conditioning that they experience life through multiple layers of filtration. Desire exists, certainly, but it's diffused, controlled, channeled into acceptable forms. The mind has learned to distract itself, to sublimate, to avoid feeling too much of anything too intensely. But when spiritual awakening cracks open that protective shell, when awareness expands and sensitivity heightens, everything becomes more vivid. Joy feels more joyful. Sorrow cuts deeper. And desire becomes a force that can no longer be casually ignored or comfortably managed. Why does this happen? Why would the path toward transcendence make you feel more trapped in the body, not less? The answer lies in a truth that Alan Watts spent decades trying to communicate to seekers who desperately wanted to escape their humanity rather than understand it. Watts recognized something that most spiritual traditions had overlooked or actively suppressed: awakening doesn't remove you from nature, it reveals that you are nature. And nature, in its essence, is energy in motion. Desire is not a flaw in the system. It's the system itself, expressing its fundamental characteristic, the impulse toward experience, toward union, toward feeling itself alive through form. But here's where the great confusion enters, where the suffering truly begins. The spiritually awakening mind, newly sensitive to its own movements, encounters this intensified desire and immediately tries to interpret it through the lens of spiritual ideals. It believes it should be above such things. It believes enlightenment means the absence of wanting. So it fights. It suppresses. It judges. And in doing so, it creates the very hell it's trying to escape. You've been taught that spiritual growth means controlling desire, transcending it, rising above it. But what if that teaching itself is the trap? What if the war you're waging against lust is not bringing you closer to peace, but tearing you apart from the inside? What if the answer isn't in conquering desire, but in understanding why it has become so overwhelming in the first place? Stay with this question. Because what lies ahead will challenge everything you've been told about spirituality, purity, and the path to freedom. Alan Watts, one of the most influential interpreters of Eastern philosophy for the Western mind, understood something that most spiritual seekers miss entirely: the problem is not desire itself, but the ego's relationship to it. When you begin to awaken, your awareness expands, but the ego does not simply vanish. Instead, it becomes more cunning, more strategic, more desperate to maintain control. And one of its favorite strategies is to wage war against the very life force moving through you. Lust, in Watts' view, is not merely sexual craving. It is life's impulse to experience itself, to merge, to feel alive through the body. When spiritual awakening begins, this impulse doesn't diminish, it intensifies. Why? Because you've removed layers of psychological numbing. You've stripped away distractions. You've opened yourself to reality as it is, unfiltered. And reality, at its core, is energy, wild, untamed, constantly seeking expression. But here's where the trap closes: spiritually awakened individuals often adopt ideals of purity, detachment, and transcendence. These ideals, while potentially inspiring, create a devastating internal division. The body desires. The mind judges. And the soul feels torn between them. This split is where the real suffering begins, because resistance doesn't diminish desire, it fuels obsession. Carl Jung, the pioneering psychologist who mapped the depths of the human psyche, explained this with surgical precision: whatever consciousness rejects does not disappear. It goes underground into what he called the shadow. When you deny desire, when you label it as unspiritual or impure, you don't eliminate it. You simply force it into the unconscious, where it grows stronger, more distorted, more compulsive. The more you try to escape desire, the more energy you feed into it. Have you ever noticed how forbidden thoughts seem to return with greater force? This is not weakness. This is psychological law. Jung observed that suppressed instincts seek expression in distorted forms. When lust is denied conscious understanding, it becomes secretive, compulsive, and saturated with guilt, not because it is inherently wrong, but because it has been exiled from awareness. Think about what happens in this internal war. You meditate, seeking peace. Desire arises. You judge it as a spiritual failure. The judgment creates shame. The shame creates more inner tension. The tension makes you more sensitive to desire. Desire intensifies. You meditate harder, trying to transcend it. The cycle deepens. You're not moving toward liberation, you're creating a prison made of your own resistance. Watts warned that spirituality becomes dangerous when it turns into a war against the self. You cannot achieve harmony by amputating parts of your nature. When awakened individuals try to rise above the body instead of including it, lust becomes the symbol of everything they fear: losing control, being trapped in matter, failing to transcend. Desire then feels like a threat to enlightenment rather than a message from life asking to be understood. This is where many spiritual traditions have catastrophically misunderstood the dynamic. Instead of teaching integration, they taught repression. Instead of awareness, they taught control. Yet the Eastern philosophies that Watts deeply admired, Taoism, Zen Buddhism, never viewed desire as evil. In Taoism, desire is simply energy, neither good nor bad. In Buddhism, craving causes suffering only when clung to or resisted. The struggle arises not from desire itself, but from the mind's refusal to allow it to flow naturally. Let me ask you something that cuts to the bone: have you ever felt that your spiritual awareness made your desires more intense rather than less? Have you questioned whether something is fundamentally wrong with you because of it? If so, understand this: you are not alone, and more importantly, you are not broken. This struggle is not a sign of spiritual failure. It is a sign that unconscious material is rising to the surface, demanding to be integrated. As awakening progresses, suppressed instincts surface because awareness acts like light. Light does not create what it reveals, it simply exposes what was already there, hidden in the dark corners of your psyche. Lust becomes visible, sometimes uncomfortably so, because the mind can no longer hide from itself. This is the threshold where many abandon the path, believing they are unworthy of spiritual depth. But this is actually the doorway to something far more profound than the sanitized version of enlightenment you've been sold. Think about how often lust appears when there is a quiet sense of inner emptiness. Not the obvious emptiness of boredom, but a subtler one, a feeling of disconnection from meaning, presence, or intimacy with life itself. Many spiritually awakened people begin to sense this emptiness more clearly because they are no longer distracted by superficial identities. As the old structures of meaning dissolve, career ambitions, social roles, cultural narratives, desire rushes in to fill the space. Lust then becomes less about the other person and more about trying to feel whole again. Alan Watts spoke frequently about how modern society fundamentally misunderstands pleasure. We are conditioned to chase intensity instead of depth, stimulation instead of presence. For the awakened mind, this contradiction becomes acutely painful. On one hand, there is growing awareness of impermanence and illusion. On the other, there is a nervous system still conditioned by thousands of years of biological instinct. Lust emerges as a powerful surge of vitality, but without understanding, it turns into compulsion rather than communion. Psychologist Viktor Frankl, who survived the Nazi concentration camps and developed logotherapy, observed that when meaning is absent, pleasure becomes a substitute. This insight is devastatingly relevant for those on a spiritual path. When old beliefs collapse and new insights have not yet stabilized, desire often fills the gap. Lust promises immediate aliveness, a brief escape from existential uncertainty. It is not simply sexual. It is a hunger to feel grounded in the body when the mind feels unmoored. Have you noticed how desire intensifies during moments of inner confusion or emotional vulnerability? This is not coincidence. The body seeks regulation through sensation. The awakened individual feels this more acutely because sensitivity has increased dramatically. Every nerve ending seems more alive. Every impulse feels louder. The tragedy is that many mistake this heightened sensitivity for moral failure rather than understanding it as a signal of unmet integration. Carl Jung described libido not merely as sexual energy, but as psychic energy itself, the fundamental life force that animates consciousness. When spiritual insight expands awareness, this energy does not disappear. It must go somewhere. If not consciously integrated, if not given healthy channels of expression, it spills into obsession. This is why lust can feel absolutely overwhelming for those who meditate, reflect, and study wisdom traditions. They have opened the channels of awareness but have not yet learned how to guide the flow. Watts emphasized a paradox that traps countless seekers: the attempt to control desire is itself desire. Wanting to be free of lust is still a form of craving. This creates a psychological loop of self-judgment. The more you judge desire, the more fragmented you feel. The more fragmented you feel, the more desperately desire seeks expression, like water finding cracks in a dam. Consider how society amplifies this internal struggle. We live in a culture saturated with sexual imagery yet starved of genuine intimacy. Desire is constantly provoked but rarely understood. Everywhere you look, advertisements, entertainment, social media, sexuality is weaponized to capture attention and sell products. For the spiritually sensitive person, this creates profound internal conflict. Awareness recognizes the manipulation and illusion. Yet the body still responds. This split deepens shame and secrecy, pushing lust further into the shadows where it festers and grows. Ask yourself honestly, is lust always about pleasure? Or is it often about wanting to be seen, touched, affirmed, or remembered? Many awakened individuals discover that beneath lust lies a profound longing for union, not merely with another body, but with life itself, with the wholeness they sense but cannot seem to embody. Watts often said that the universe experiences itself through us. From this perspective, desire is not personal failure. It is cosmic movement expressed through individual form. When this is not understood, when the awakened person believes desire proves their inadequacy, they feel isolated. They imagine that others on the spiritual path are more disciplined, more pure, more advanced. But the truth is that many carry the same struggle in silence. Spiritual communities often reward appearances of control rather than honesty. This creates environments where desire must be hidden instead of transformed. The consequence? People suffer alone, convinced their inner battle is evidence of spiritual unworthiness, never realizing that the battle itself is the problem, not the desire. What if lust is not the enemy, but a messenger? What if it's pointing not toward indulgence, but toward presence, toward parts of yourself still waiting to be acknowledged, felt, and integrated? When desire is no longer treated as an enemy, something profound begins to shift. The struggle softens, not because lust disappears, but because the inner war ends. Alan Watts often reminded his listeners that life is not meant to be conquered. It is meant to be experienced. The moment you stop fighting desire as if it were a flaw in your character, you begin to see its intelligence. Lust carries information. It reveals where energy is blocked, where intimacy with oneself is missing, and where consciousness has not yet fully descended into the body. One of the greatest misunderstandings on the spiritual path is the idea that awakening happens only in the mind. Many people wake up cognitively, they understand impermanence, illusion, non-duality. They can discuss philosophy with sophistication. But their bodies remain conditioned by fear, tension, and unmet emotional needs. This creates a devastating split. The mind speaks the language of transcendence while the body speaks the language of sensation. Lust becomes the bridge between these two worlds, but only if it is allowed to be felt without distortion. Wilhelm Reich, a student of Freud who profoundly influenced body-oriented psychology, observed that suppressed sexual energy doesn't simply vanish, it transforms into anxiety, aggression, and compulsive behavior. From this perspective, lust is not excess energy. It is trapped energy. Spiritually awakened people often intensify this trap by adding spiritual judgment to biological impulses. They don't merely repress desire, they spiritualize the repression, believing that transcendence requires the denial of the body. This is why the struggle feels so exhausting. Jung warned that spirituality without integration leads to what he called inflation. The ego identifies with higher ideals and distances itself from instinct. This creates a false sense of elevation while the shadow grows stronger in the basement of consciousness. Lust then appears in intrusive thoughts, fantasies, or secret behaviors that feel utterly out of control. The psyche demands balance. What is denied in daylight returns at night, often with greater intensity. Watts approached this with both humor and piercing clarity. He pointed out that trying to be above desire is just another desire, the desire to be superior to nature, to transcend what you fundamentally are. True awakening, according to him, is realizing that you are nature. Your impulses are not obstacles to the path. They are part of the terrain. When you stop pretending otherwise, desire loses its compulsive edge. Have you ever noticed that lust feels strongest when you are disconnected from your body, not when you are fully present in it? Many people confuse presence with suppression. But presence is the opposite. Presence means feeling sensation without immediately acting on it or escaping from it. It means allowing desire to rise, peak, and fall naturally, like a wave that doesn't require your intervention to complete its cycle. When this happens, something transformative occurs. Lust transforms from obsession into vitality. Ancient Taoist teaching spoke of sexual energy as life force. When circulated consciously through practices like Qigong or Tantric meditation, it nourishes clarity, creativity, and emotional stability. When blocked by fear or moral rigidity, it stagnates and becomes toxic. Spiritually awakened individuals often sense this energy powerfully but don't know how to relate to it skillfully. They oscillate between indulgence and denial, never discovering the middle path of awareness. Let me ask you something uncomfortable but absolutely necessary. What if the intensity of your lust is proportional to how much of yourself you are still afraid to embody? Awakening calls not only for expanded consciousness but for deeper incarnation. It asks you to fully inhabit your humanity, not escape it. Watts often criticized spiritual paths that treated the body as a problem to be solved. He argued that enlightenment which excludes the body is incomplete, a kind of spiritual bypassing that creates fragmented human beings who can discuss transcendence while remaining deeply alienated from their own physical existence. Desire then becomes the rebel, forcing attention back to what has been neglected. Lust is the body saying, "Remember me. Feel me. Include me." When desire is met with curiosity instead of judgment, it begins to change quality. It slows down. It becomes more subtle, less urgent, less demanding. The mind no longer needs to fantasize compulsively because sensation itself becomes rich enough. This is not repression, it is refinement through awareness. Modern neuroscience supports this ancient wisdom. Studies on mindfulness show that observing impulses without acting on them reduces compulsive behavior over time. Awareness strengthens the prefrontal cortex's capacity to stay present with discomfort and pleasure alike. Lust loses its power to dominate because it is no longer unconscious, no longer hidden, no longer forbidden. As this integration deepens, desire no longer feels like a threat to spirituality. It becomes a teacher, showing where attachment still lives, where fear still hides, and where love wants to grow. At the deepest level, Alan Watts offered an insight that dissolves the entire conflict around lust and spirituality, an insight so radical that it undermines the very foundation upon which spiritual struggle is built. He said that freedom is not found by getting rid of desire, but by seeing that there is no separate controller standing outside of it. Desire happens. Thoughts happen. Sensations happen. The suffering begins only when the mind creates a false observer who claims ownership and tries to manipulate what is already moving through consciousness like wind through trees. This is the final and most powerful realization, the one that changes everything. Lust does not enslave you. The belief that you must either obey it or destroy it is what creates bondage. When desire arises and is fully allowed into awareness, without resistance, without indulgence, without the story of, "I am desiring," it reveals its empty nature. It has intensity but no permanence. It has movement but no command. It is simply energy passing through consciousness, not a verdict on who you are or a measure of your spiritual worth. Spiritually awakened people struggle most intensely when they believe enlightenment should feel clean, controlled, and serene at all times. This expectation creates violence against natural experience. Watts warned that spirituality becomes toxic when it turns life into a self-improvement project, when you treat yourself as a broken machine that needs fixing. The moment you try to perfect yourself, you step out of harmony with the organic flow that already knows how to balance itself. Think carefully about this truth: the ocean does not try to calm its waves. The forest does not apologize for its wild growth. The sky doesn't judge the storms that pass through it. Yet humans, in their peculiar arrogance, believe they must edit themselves to deserve peace. Lust is simply one of the waves moving through the ocean of your being. When you stop labeling it as a spiritual flaw, when you stop making it mean something about your adequacy or evolution, it loses the power to define you. Carl Jung described the journey toward wholeness as individuation, the process of becoming a complete human being. But wholeness, Jung insisted, does not mean purity. It means inclusion. The shadow is not eliminated through spiritual practice. It is integrated. Desire no longer hides in the basement of consciousness, feeding on secrecy and shame. Instead, it becomes transparent. And what becomes transparent loses its compulsive grip. Many awakened individuals notice something extraordinary when they stop fighting lust: it naturally changes form. It becomes less obsessive, less urgent, less desperate. It loses that quality of frantic hunger and transforms into something more spacious. Attraction becomes appreciation. Sexual energy becomes creative energy. Longing becomes presence. And this is not discipline imposed from above by willpower, it is wisdom emerging organically from understanding. Watts emphasized that when you see through the illusion of the separate self, when you realize there is no little person inside your head pulling levers and controlling experience, desire no longer feels personal. It is life enjoying itself through form, the universe experiencing its own aliveness through your nervous system. When this is truly recognized, not just intellectually understood but felt in the marrow of your being, shame dissolves. Guilt dissolves. What remains is responsibility without repression, awareness without fear. Ask yourself this honestly: what if your struggle with lust was never meant to be conquered but understood? What if it was the very mechanism through which life was inviting you to inhabit your humanity more fully? Not as a problem to solve, but as a mystery to live with grace and curiosity. When desire arises now, you no longer ask, "How do I stop this?" You ask different questions: what is actually being felt right now? Where is this sensation located in my body? What story is my mind adding to raw experience? This simple shift in orientation changes everything. Presence replaces control. Curiosity replaces judgment. Integration replaces inner war. This is the paradox Watts pointed to again and again in his teachings: the moment you stop trying to be spiritual, you begin to live spiritually. The moment you stop trying to transcend desire, desire finds its rightful place in the ecosystem of your being. Not as a master demanding obedience. Not as an enemy requiring constant vigilance. But as a movement within the whole, one current among many in the river of your experience. True awakening does not remove your humanity. It reveals it without distortion, without the layers of judgment and conditioning that made you afraid of your own aliveness. Lust then becomes neither a secret shame nor a dangerous force threatening your spiritual progress. It becomes one expression of vitality among many, sometimes present, sometimes absent, but never requiring the exhausting performance of control. Seen clearly, held in spacious awareness, desire simply passes. It arises, peaks, and subsides like every other phenomenon in consciousness. And in that passing, something extraordinary is discovered: peace was never on the other side of desire. It was never waiting for you to finally conquer lust and prove yourself worthy. Peace was always in the awareness that could hold desire without becoming it, without fighting it, without needing it to be different than it is. This is what Watts called the wisdom of insecurity, the recognition that trying to make yourself permanently secure, permanently pure, permanently in control is the very thing that keeps you trapped. Life is fluid. Consciousness is fluid. Energy is fluid. When you stop damming the river, when you stop trying to freeze the flow into acceptable shapes, everything moves with less friction. You discover that you are not a static thing that occasionally experiences desire. You are the experiencing itself, vast enough to include desire, transcendent enough not to be defined by it, present enough to feel it fully without being consumed. The spiritually awakened person who has integrated this truth no longer lives in conflict. They don't wage war against parts of themselves. They don't split reality into higher and lower, pure and impure, spiritual and carnal. They recognize these divisions as conceptual constructs that create suffering where none need exist. Desire arises. It's allowed. It's felt. It's neither indulged compulsively nor rejected violently. It's simply experienced as what it is, energy moving, life expressing, consciousness playing with form. And when it passes, as all things pass, there is no residue of shame, no feeling of failure, no desperate grasping to make it return or vow to prevent its return. This is freedom. Not freedom from desire, but freedom within it. Not the absence of lust, but the end of the war against it. Not transcendence of the body, but the full, conscious inhabiting of embodied existence. Awakening, in its deepest sense, is not about becoming something else. It is about finally allowing yourself to be whole, messy, alive, desiring, aware, human, and divine all at once, without needing to choose between them. If this reflection has touched something true in you, consider sharing your experience. Your honesty might help someone who believes they are alone in this struggle. And remember, the path is not about perfection. It is about presence. Not about rising above life, but about diving fully into it with eyes wide open.